Welcome to ABC Discourse. In this program, we used to discuss on some of the top issues of international relations, global politics, successes and the lessons learnt by the nations. Today, we have Professor Gary Litt. We have invited Professor Gary Litt for strategic development issues of the Singapore. Professor Gary has been associated with Nanyang University of Singapore, and he has postgraduate degree in United Kingdom and Australia. He has keenly observed the issues of the transformation, especially the changes occurred in United Kingdom. Professor Gary, now in Nepal, is to deliver a speech in International Relations Department of Tribhuvan University. He is a visiting professor for 30 international universities. Welcome to Professor Litt to our ABC studio.
Namaste.
Namaste. Professor Gary, let us talk about Singapore. Some 50 years ago, when Singapore was established, and the founding father, Lee Kuan Yew, has put forward the long-term national interest and set some standards for transformation. That's why the Singapore now turned into third world to the first world in a single generation. What was the process of transformation and how was it possible?
In fact, in just less than 30 years, Singapore already achieved developed world status by about the mid-90s. Now, the story of Singapore is largely driven by the story of Lee Kuan Yew, a highly dynamic, visionary, and interventionist leader. All right, let me bring you back. Let me bring the audience back 50 years ago at the point of independence in the early 60s and so. A world at the time was a very different world. It is a world which has seen the birth of many post-colonial nations, and also many of these post-colonial leaders were largely socialist leaders and anti-colonialists, and they adopt policies like import substitution and even anti-foreigner investors sentiment. So, people like Sukarno of Indonesia, Fidel Castro of Cuba, Tito of Yugoslavia, Nasser of Egypt, and even Nehru of India. Now, nearly all of these leaders are highly anti-colonial and socialist, and that's why they formed the non-aligned movement in 1955. They call it the Bandung Conference. Now, why I'm saying all this is to give you the backdrop, the historical backdrop, how Singapore transformed itself and how Lee Kuan Yew policies stand against and alone in the context of all these larger political and historical forces shaping the developing world at that time. Singapore is very unique at the time because unlike many of these so-called highly radical leaders of the post-colonial nations, Singapore stood firm, and this demonstrates the vision and the conviction of Lee Kuan Yew. And Singapore believed in having an open door policy to welcome foreign direct investment, unlike the other post-colonial nations. So Lee Kuan Yew believed that foreign direct investment, especially by multinational companies, are very crucial and critical to the early development of an economy of a fledgling post-colonial nation like Singapore, which has no resources. Don't forget the fact that foreign direct investment bring in all the top management expertise. They bring in much needed capital and foreign direct investment. That means to say there's a great boost to your capital base, provide a lot of jobs, employment, right? And also established market for all your goods that is produced. So there are multiple advantages and benefits accrued to this foreign direct investment policies that Lee Kuan Yew put in place in the early years.
Some people still say that Lee Kuan Yew was a benevolent dictator. He is a liberal dictator. In this response, did the then government of Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew face any hurdles, any difficulties during the process of transformation?
Yes, certainly. Don't forget the fact that Lee Kuan Yew being the first Prime Minister, when he led Singapore from the start since independence, Singapore at the time, in fact, was poorer than some African states. You may not believe it, but it's true. The GDP is very low, facing lots of problems, housing, social, unemployment, even the defense, and so on and so forth. So there were indeed a lot of challenges, difficulties, tensions, contradictions, dilemmas, and even paradoxes, because not forgetting the fact that Singapore is a tiny island city-state, right, squeezed between two giant neighbors. And at the time, there was also this confrontation going on because Indonesia under Sukarno, I was telling you about, is a firebrand radical leader, wasn't very cooperative towards Singapore. And Singapore was indeed facing not just normal problems, but in fact, existential survival problems. All right? So Singapore managed to overcome all these problems through the dynamic interventionist policies and also the policy vision. That's very important. The policy leadership and the policy ownership and the policy vision of this strong dynamic leader called Lee Kuan Yew, where he promoted these very important institutional values and processes such as meritocracy, efficiency, transparency, accountability, and competency. Now, all these values are part of his legacy to Singapore and to what has helped and drive Singapore to achieve the success it has today. In fact, very interestingly, when I was giving interviews on the Ukrainian and other Russian television, they asked me the fact that if Singapore was such a successful and great leader, why is it that today there are no streets, no building, or even no airport named after Lee Kuan Yew, right? Now, the fact actually is that Lee Kuan Yew did not believe in having statues or streets or monuments named after him. Right, as you go to Paris today, you can see statues of Napoleon here or Napoleon there, or London, you see Winston Churchill there, or even in America, you have the Kennedy Airport or the Ronald Reagan Airport, or Moscow for that matter, you can see statues of Lenin or Stalin. But in Singapore, there are no statues, sorry to say, no monuments, no streets or buildings named after Lee Kuan Yew, because Lee Kuan Yew believed that the most important thing are the institutional values and the institutional systems that he built and passed on to the people so that they can remember in both their heart and in their mind, which is more important. And that's why this famous book by Professor Robinson Asimov Group, MIT, published 5 years ago, they were also talking about the importance of institutional factors that led to the success of a nation. And the book title, by the way, if your audience wants to know, is called Why Nations Fail. Now, while Professor Robinson and Asimov Group published the book 5 years ago, it's a very good book, I recommend you to read. Lee Kuan Yew already implemented these ideas 50 years ago, before even the professors were born.
Let us relate with Nepal.
Yes.
Singapore's experience with Nepal. Top Nepali leaders, some of the top Nepali leaders always used to say that our development model is to make Nepal as Singapore. In their public speech, in their slogans, and everywhere they used to say. Though Nepal has crossed a very long history and now turned into the republic, some 2050 years old kingship, now turned into Republic of Nepal. And during the period, a long time of instability, has now ended by the promulgation of the new constitution. And we have now a relatively stable government and a stable political situation. At that condition, how do you suggest or how do you tell about the policy? What should be the policy? What may be the policy for Nepal? What may be the lessons for Nepal to be learned from Singapore?
Right. Thank you.
There may be critical policy tension, there may be policy dilemma, there may be policy experience, like so on.
Sure. And let me take this opportunity to wish you and all your audience in Nepal Happy National Day and Happy Constitution Day. I'm so privileged to be here today to celebrate and take part in the joy and the celebrations of the National Constitution Day. About your question, how Singapore policy lessons can be applied to Nepal. Indeed, there are many ways where it can be applied for Nepal. For instance, I've shared with you some of the very important institutional values like meritocracy, efficiency, transparency, accountability, competency. Now, those are some of the institutional values that your government can give special consideration and see how you can promote these values in the context of Nepal, right? As well as the fact that I'm glad to note that Nepal has managed to establish political stability after all the long years, decades of struggle. And so now that your economy and your society is finally, stable, it's time to move on, to see how you can develop it further, to move from a lower base to a higher peak. And so things are very important, to make sure that the nation is strong and stable, to develop the kind of national cohesiveness and the national identity because of the many ethnic groups and diversity that you have, right? So, like for example, starting from the school or the colleges, you would have maybe students singing the national anthem or saying the national pledge or organizing activities that promote this sort of national spirit, all right? Now, there's also the other things to look at, for example, your foreign direct investment policy, your tax policy, and even maybe we'll be talking about some of the other things later on as well.
You often raise the question of the political leadership is the main responsible for the transformation. What are the basic characteristics for the political leadership to transform a country into a prosperous one? Yes,
very good question, very good question. It is a question that has often been understated and underemphasized by many Western scholars, Western liberal, so-called liberal scholars, because obviously the Western liberal perspective and experience has been very different from our Asian experience. And not forgetting the fact that the Westminster Parliament model as well as the Washington model has developed to what it is today after 200-300 years of political experiment, So we do not have the kind of luxury, all right? Many of us have been, as you have said, we have struggled through tumultuous period of struggles and even turbulence. So we have to bring it up to speed very quickly. We do not have the 200-300 years of luxury to develop at that pace. And therefore, some of the Western or Anglo-Saxon models may not be very applicable or transferable to our local context because we have to take into account the local history, local culture, local politics. So policy applicability, policy transferability must ultimately depend on policy and political acceptability, right? So now coming back to the leadership factor, which is so important. Now Lee Kuan Yew is well known for his authoritarian style of government. Yeah. It's also known as a benevolent, in fact, some call it benevolent dictatorship, if there's such a term. So what is happening is that at least in the initial early stages of the national independence, you need to have a strong, visionary, dynamic leader at the top to drive the policy agenda, to drive the policy goals in order to achieve the final objective for the government, for the people. Now, it's not just a case of Singapore alone. If you look at the World Bank report titled East Asian Economic Miracle, it started off with Japan in the 60s, Korea in the 70s, Korea, the East Asian economic tigers, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and followed by the second wave tigers like Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, China in a big way. And now we're talking, Vietnam is taking off in a big way too. So if you look at all these examples, in fact, in the 70s, Korea has a very strong leader, Park Chung-hee. Yeah. Taiwan has a strong leader called Jiang Zhuguo, the son of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. Singapore, of course, Lee Kuan Yew. Malaysia had a strong leader called Mahathir, which very surprisingly is now the newest leader. So the newest leader is the oldest leader actually at 93. And of course in China you have Deng Xiaoping, another very strong one, who opened the doors of China, the open door policy of China. So as you can see, many of these countries managed to achieve successful transformation through very powerful, effective political leadership, through strong leadership, at least in initial stages of development.
The identity of Singapore to present day old is zero tolerance on corruption.
Yes.
But Nepal and some other countries of the South Asia and most of the developing countries are facing a huge problem of corruption. Corruption has been just turning into a cancer for transformation, for reform. How Singapore, just for instance,
Yes.
for example, take an example of police force.
Yes.
Singapore, all of the police force has been fired and another force has been hired. What we can do to rise the anti-corruption movement?
It's a very good question. Thank you for raising that question, because this is a question also asked by many of the people in the many countries I visited, in Eastern Europe in particular, where they are presently undergoing major transition in societies and economies. So coming back to the Singapore context, I'm glad to say that Singapore has been ranked very highly, together with countries like New Zealand and Denmark as well, among the top, in this transparency index. There's this transparency index which measures how corruption-free the country is. So to answer your question directly, how Singapore managed to combat corruption, firstly, the political leadership in the case of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, must personify, must set a very high example, must set a very high benchmark. If the Prime Minister specifies and requires that all his members of cabinet declare the assets, and conform to this high benchmark of transparency and openness and clean government, then the rest of the civil service have to follow, all right? So in other words, the political leadership has to be set right. So the Prime Minister himself has to be clean, or seen to be clean, so that the rest of the cabinet and the civil service and the population will follow in the example. At the same time, I must say that the salary or the pay policy is also an important determining factor. For instance, coming back to the police, many of the, in fact, nearly all the branches of civil service in Singapore are quite highly paid. Yeah. Probably one of the highest paid in the world. So the police, they are facing or subject to daily temptation, of bribery, small, big, $1 here, $10 there, and things like that. And because of the strict leadership, all right, the high benchmark of example, as well as a good pay policy, so there's lesser temptation to bribery. Now, as I travel around the world, especially in developing countries, I can see police literally accepting bribes when they stop the motorists and they say $10 here or $20 here. But you can never find that on the streets of Singapore, even in any offices, government offices, because you will be very severe, it will face a very severe punishment. Let me share with you a tragic example in '86 when a senior minister of Singapore, all right, he was implicated in a corruption scandal. He called Lee Kuan Yew for help. And Lee Kuan Yew said he was a very good friend with Lee Kuan Yew for many years, setting up the party in the initial years of political struggle and nationhood building. And yet Lee Kuan Yew says, sorry buddy, no help for you. And in the end, he had to commit suicide, which is a very sad case. So you can see that despite the close friendship and many years of close friendship together with his friend, Lee Kuan Yew refused to help because, again, as I said, he set a very high example. It must be very painful to his heart, but he has to think about the long-term national interest and not the short-term personal interest. We have to set a long policy goals and vision for the country, right? So it's a very harsh, you might say, harsh policy, but nevertheless, it conveyed a message to the population that, Singapore is zero tolerance for corruption.
We have very poor institutions, very weak institutions. At that condition, how we can, what can be done to understand the general public about the reform, especially when opposition parties generally says this is political repression?
I think in a multi-party multi-party system, multi-party body politics like Nepal, or for that matter in many other countries of the world, there has to be some kind of a political compromise. Yeah. Now, the eventual settlement, the political settlement, of course, I'm no expert in local politics, But what kind of political bargain, what kind of political settlement eventually has to be decided between the various parties. But nevertheless, certain core principles and values, institutional values, cannot be compromised. For example, corruption. And that's where, as I said before, the policy leadership is so important, all right? Like, for example, when it comes to corruption, the people must hold the government leaders accountable. Yes. So that if they are seen to fail on these important principles, then they have to be accountable in the election process. In other words, they will win or lose election depending on whether they can promise what, whether they can deliver what they promise.
Next one, in your observation, what are the potentials for the development of Nepal?
I think Nepal has got very good potential.
What are the priorities for the development priorities?
Right. Number one, I think Nepal has to, as I said, establish the national cohesiveness, national identity for the nation to rise together, to share in the fruits and to reap the benefit of the growth together, so that not only the elite will enjoy the fruits of the development, all right, and they have to be shared by all levels and all members of all walks of life in society, so that everybody has a stake, has an ownership, has a sense of responsibility in ensuring the growth, the prosperity, the development of the nation. And that's one thing. And number two, of course, as I've alluded to, some of the policies that I mentioned about the foreign direct investment, some of the economic policy, the financial incentive policy, and things like that, and the institutional values. Now, all these things have to come in. These are the jigsaw puzzles, to ensure that you have got these appropriate policies in place to support, to drive, to promote the economic growth.
Let's talk about the globalization. The geographical location of Nepal is in between the two old superpowers, old economic superpowers, India and China. And at this stage, what should be the potential and importance and opportunities for Nepal's development priorities?
That's a very good point you have raised. In a way, Nepal is fortunate to be placed, between two giant neighbors who are rising, so that if you could, do trade, with both of them, you would benefit tremendously. In fact, very interestingly, in the BRI conference, Professor Dai mentioned actually, organized by Tribhuvan University, Professor Dai actually mentioned that Nepal can be the pearl or the diamond of the pick, So it's a very interesting vision. And it depends on how Nepal manage these relations. They have to dance carefully between the two giant neighbors. And in a way, if Nepal can manage it carefully, it can rise. There's an enormous potential for Nepal to be able to benefit, to tap onto the growing prosperity in the market of this giant, you're talking about multi-billion-dollar market and multi-billion population, rising middle class, huge potential. Of course, Nepal itself also has got many wonderful natural blessings, like your wonderful, snow-capped mountain, alpine forest, beautiful lakes and forests and river system and so on. You have got tremendous potential for tourism, cultural tourism, ecotourism and so on. So Nepal has got a lot of potential, and you have a very young, generally a very young population base, so you're looking forward to reap the kind of demographic dividend, unlike many of the Asian neighbors like Japan or even Singapore or even China, where society are growing old rapidly. So you do have a lot of factors in your favor. So it's up to the government to manage it, depending on those things that I mentioned earlier on, the various policy processes. So there are many, many good pieces, assets that you have on hand at the moment.
Thank you, Professor Lit, for giving us your valuable time.
Thank you. Thank you.